All right, excellent. All right, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And my name is Jason Larson, and I'm the head of content here at the International Institute for Analytics. And I'm your host for today's session. And welcome to today's webinar, Beyond the Math, Rethinking ROI in Enterprise Analytics. In case you're new to the International Institute for Analytics, more commonly known as IIA, we are an independent, strategic, outcome-focused data and analytics advisory firm. We're practitioners working with practitioners. Analytics is all we do, and we do it with a relentless focus on measurable impact. Visit our homepage for more information about who we are and how we support data and analytics leaders in making the difficult and necessary transition to advanced analytics and AI. All right, before we dive into the presentation, let's go over a few housekeeping items. First, I encourage you to join IIA Expert Scott Friesen on August 19th as he shares his framework for communicating analytics value as we all head into budget season and 2026 planning. In Scott's session, you'll learn about his portfolio approach to analytics work, how he educates business leaders below the waterline, and how he thinks and acts like a marketer to promote his team's work. Scott's session will be a really nice complement to the insights you hear today, so we look forward to seeing you there. For today's session, we encourage you to submit questions or comments via the chat window, and we'll make sure to save time at the end of the session to address as many questions as possible. As people who are familiar with our webinars, the dialogue and questions that you bring to the table really add tremendous value to the sessions. We like to keep it pretty organic here. It makes you an active participant. It brings some energy to the speakers. Don't be shy. Converse as a group in the comments, share resources, send us your questions. That level of engagement generates more takeaways for us all. A recorded version of this webinar and slides will be available after the presentation. All right, without further ado, we are delighted to welcome Amit Mohindra as our featured speaker today. Amit is an IIA expert and founder and CEO of People Analytics Success, a Boston-based global analytics and AI advisory coaching and education firm. He led global teams at Apple, Goldman Sachs, IBM, McKesson, and Wayfair. And as an expert in our advisory network, Amit has supported IIA clients on a wide range of challenges. Most notably, I would say he's kind of become a go-to expert for us on questions related to capturing and communicating analytics and AI value. He has a practical and I would say provocative point of view on the topic of ROI for analytics and AI. Today, he's going to help us reframe the ROI conversation by exploring why traditional finance models fall short when applied to analytics and AI work, and most importantly, how to approach ROI from a relational perspective. Amit's point of view aligns with II's thinking on this subject. We believe that analytics leaders need a new framework that breaks from traditional finance models to capture the true value of analytics and AI and effectively communicate it to the business. To support the data and analytics community, we recently launched a comprehensive resource hub to help analytics leaders navigate their ROI challenges. Key considerations for measurement, communication best practices, how best to leverage the softer components of analytics value for business visibility and investment, integrating risk mitigation into your ROI estimates, and best practices in measuring value in a federated analytics model. That's all on the hub. So check it out for tools and tips on those topics and more, including a free download of our flagship ebook that you see on the screen here on analytics ROI, which introduces IIA's returned business value framework designed to help you align initiatives to strategy, manage real world risk, and build value stories that stand up to scrutiny. All right, so before I pass it over to Amit, don't hesitate to contact us to learn more about how we support analytics leaders and their teams on ROI challenges or to further the conversation with Amit. All right, with that said, Amit, I'll let you take it from here, my friend.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for investing your time with us. I'm going to start with an unusual slide. I'm going to go to philosophy, which may be an unusual way to start a conversation among technologists and analysts. But I'm going to talk about the human condition. And I'm not sure if this is a school of thought from existentialism or some other philosophical school. Perhaps the ability to communicate ROI for our projects is existential in some way. But what I wanted to put across is that we're actually in our business, in the work we do, we're condemned to make decisions under uncertainty with finite resources. So we all live in a world where we have to survive in a constrained resource environment. So we're always doing constrained optimization. And strategy, after all, is about choice. And these are the choices that we're trying to uh, influence uh, to get investment in enterprise analytics. So before we go further, let me just give a quick introduction. Jason already gave one, so I won't say too much. It's been a real privilege to be an expert with IIA, some fantastic conversations. I began my journey as a research economist and then fell into HR. I'm a labor economist by training and got into consulting and then various corporate roles. And now I lead people analytics success. I also teach a course on people analytics at Stanford remotely. And starting next year, I'll be teaching at Babson College, a graduate course. So the next 40, 45 minutes or so, I'd really like this to be interactive so we can have a conversation. There's lots to talk about. And what I'd like to do is just set the baseline with a couple of ideas and then talk about the hegemony of finance. How did finance become the boss? And then talk about what perhaps we can start here, the counter revolution. You're not the boss of me, finance. And throughout, we'll talk about some winning strategies. And maybe at the end, I'd love to hear some of your ideas, some strategies that have worked for you in this explanation of ROI challenge that we have. So, in terms of the landscape, I know the title is about enterprise analytics, but I think it applies equally to enterprise artificial intelligence. I think many of us are working across both areas. There's a very neat synergy. So, and I think a lot of what I talk about is applicable in both areas. Now, when you think about AI in particular, one of the challenges that we face is to most people, AI still is a black box. And we're trying very hard to make it a gray box. It probably won't be a translucent box. We can never truly understand what's happening in those neural networks. But AI in the workplace is causing a great deal of confusion, of fear, and anxiety. And that's also affecting us as leaders, as managers, as workers, and even as parents. So I think it's important to take a look at how we interpret problems. Now, it's important to consider these two paradigms. One is if you look at the world in terms of technical problems, and I think we often fall into this camp in the technology and analytics world, that it's a technical problem, and a technical problem has typically an answer. You can always get to a technical solution. The mathematics equations will eventually solve. You'll find some sort of solution, and you can often find standardized solutions available as well. And these technical problems require technical skills to solve. Now, because we're dealing with AI and we're dealing with communication and we're dealing with persuasion, it becomes really important to also think of these and other problems as relational problems. And relational problems are also known as adaptive problems, but they involve a lot of the human condition, a lot of the softer things that often folks in analytics and technology are not comfortable with. And so we tend to gravitate towards looking at things from a technical perspective. So these sorts of problems require us to think in terms of values and behaviors, perspectives, and bring to bear things like collaboration, learning, and adaptation. And it's often very ambiguous. There are no often clear-cut standard solutions. Every particular relational problem is different. And I would argue that the adoption of analytics, the adoption of AI, and the communication of value, these are all relational problems. Now let's get to the hegemony of finance. And I think finance has evolved quite a bit. It used to be just plain and simple accounting, and now it's become a very strategic function that the HR function, and I think in some respects the technology function, aspires to. So we are condemned to essentially look at the world the way finance does when we talk about ROI. So we have discounted cash flow analysis. We've got to try and set the net present value to zero in this equation and solve for R, which becomes the internal rate of return. Compare that to the weighted average cost of capital, depending on where it stands against that benchmark, you get the investment or not. Or in even simpler terms, what's the return you get in exchange for the investment that you make? So I will point out that this is about as complicated as it gets in finance. Apart from discounted cash flow, it's all arithmetic. So we can deal with that. I don't think it's that difficult. In HR, in people analytics, we deal with stochastic calculus in many respects. So the challenges of finance and accounting, in my opinion, are not that difficult. Now, some of you who speak French or who are history buffs might appreciate this slide. ROI is king. And every analytics leader, every technology leader has at some point in their career faced the question, what's the ROI? What ROI can we anticipate from this project, from this application? And it's often a prerequisite for any kind of funding or even for ongoing funding. But the problem with ROI is, I think everyone on this call probably recognizes, is that it doesn't capture the entire story. It captures some of the financials. It certainly doesn't capture any of the non-financials. And it's very lopsided in that respect, right? There's so much more under the waterline that's not being recognized and not being measured. All kinds of things, lots of leading indicators, lots of measurements around data literacy, about adoption, resilience, adaptability, sustainability. There's just so much that needs to be captured, but the lens of ROI is so narrow that nothing else gets through that narrow aperture. There's nothing about innovation, nothing about learning, nothing about capability building. You really have to um, uh, try very hard to get those into the ROI framework. And these non-financial measures make a huge difference. So in this study by Ittner and Larker, organizations that track non-financial performance and establish that causal link to financial outcomes earned 1.5 times greater returns on equity than those companies that didn't focus on non-financials. So it makes a big difference. Now, early in my career, I used to sob myself asleep with this mantra. I don't think it's actually something that Einstein said it might be, but it carries more weight when you put his picture on it. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. I think it's a very fair statement, but it doesn't help often because we're being forced into trying to provide that very formal ROI using discounted cash flow analysis. Let me pause here. Any questions or comments or thoughts in the chat or Q&A, Jason?
So there is one here. Considering kind of around the idea of how should analytics leaders handle the discomfort finance leaders may feel when we introduce more qualitative or non-financial ROI measures?
Yeah, I mean, you can be sure if we're feeling uncomfortable about it, the folks in finance are also going to feel uncomfortable because they too are a quantitative function. So I think it's important to bring it up. And I think if you frame it in that context of relational problems and give some background and context around how we need to think about this in a different way to open up that aperture, you can begin to have a conversation. It won't happen right away. For me, it's taken years to get people to think in different terms. It's not a natural thing for finance, right? Because they're so wed to that model and they have to plug stuff into a spreadsheet at some point. Um, and they're going to have a hard time explaining things to their management, right? That doesn't fit the mold. So it's not easy. But I think you've got to try and start finding those folks in finance, hopefully they're finance leaders, maybe even the CFO, who are open to a conversation and are sensitive um, to what ROI doesn't measure.
Yes. Okay, great, great. And we do have a nice comment here, very true, though, when we accept this line of thinking, we also have to be prepared and mindful to not discredit other business units that believe they're adding value by intuition and anecdotes, but can't prove it. It's a delicate balance. I really like that comment.
Absolutely. That is a great comment. You know, there's so many different ways to observe and measure and add some sort of value, quantitative or qualitative. We absolutely have to be sensitive to every function's situation. And one of the other problems with ROI, there are many problems. We're not going to go into all of them, but another one is it sort of assumes causality. But causality is so hard to establish, right? There are these three conditions that have to be met. The first two you can often meet quite easily, but this notion of control that you have to be able to rule out every other factor, it's very hard. Um, and you can try with statistical models, but it's very, very difficult. And so you can't really always demonstrate true causality. You can get close. You can use statistics to bolster your case. But what happens is that the business units that are using the platforms, they claim their own wins, and finance is then left wondering whether the investment paid off or not. It did clearly, but the attribution is very difficult, and we get often very stuck in the attribution trap um, because we can't control for everything. And so we're sometimes nervous to take credit for things. So then let's get to the counter revolution. And as history buffs probably know, that for every revolution, there is typically a counter revolution that happens because at some level, uh, it's a question of politics. And I think Jack Phillips just dropped a blog post this morning about power and maybe even politics in the storytelling around ROI and value. So take a look at that if you haven't already. So this is where we sort of question finance's hegemony over the ability to judge whether something has true value or not. And so let's explore what this is. Now, there's another measurement or another paradigm that's also kind of teetering, and that's the notion of gross domestic product, right? So, gross domestic product is an 80-year-old metric that was created when the economy was very different. It was mostly manufacturing, and we had sort of standard industrial employment. And the economy is so different now. Digital, global, increasing predominance of intangible things, that GDP is not necessarily the best way to measure economic output or even productivity. So if GDP can fall, then I think so can ROI in terms of being that one standard. We have to begin to have this conversation. So the most important thing I think is you've really got to reframe the discussion. You've got to try and bring the focus away from ROI, away from quantitative, perhaps, because as soon as you get stuck in looking at value from a formulaic standpoint, then you've really lost the plot. And this is from the ebook that Jason had mentioned right before the webinar began. So you really have to reframe and get the finance folks and others to think a little bit differently about value, because you really have to begin to introduce the notions of organizational trust, stakeholder satisfaction that are way beyond ROI. Now, if you are going to reframe, then my recommendation is that you reframe completely. I would not go with half-baked reframing, because if you try and force fit your new frame into the same construct as ROI, but just adjust the definition to sort of fit your particular situation in, more than likely you're going to get very unnatural numbers. And I don't know about you, but if you go in with double digit, triple digit, in some cases quadruple digit ROI numbers, you're likely to be laughed out of the room. So you just have to be very careful. Now, I'm not saying that the value isn't there, but these are things you have to be mindful of when you have conversations with finance, that they have a range of believability in terms of what ROI projects can deliver. And you may be in the high side. You likely will, because technology and analytics enable so much in a modern corporation. But you have to be just being mindful of what the distribution of ROIs that ordinary finance folks see. Um, if you're an outlier, it makes your case even more unbelievable. So just be very careful about uh, going half-baked on the reframing. Any questions or thoughts in the chat or Q&A, Jason?
Yeah, there's one that came through here, and let me pull it up. Going back to the quote in the beginning of this session. So, is there any evidence of correlation versus causation on the 1.5 ROE quote? For example, were the companies that used it all tech versus non-tech not using it? Do you have any insight there, Amit?
Yeah, so I would say it's not causation. I think it'll be very hard to prove that. So they looked at companies and their return on equity, and then looked at whether they were focusing on non-financials. And so it's a correlation. I can't recall right now the degree of correlation. Um, but what they decided to compute was the differences, the ratio of return on equity from one group versus the other.
Okay, okay, that makes
The
sense.
for all the quotes and all the studies, I've given a direct link to the source in the footnotes, so you can always dig deeper.
Okay. All right. And one more before you proceed. So, do you agree that quantified value should be part of a portfolio of measures of value? If you abandon the traditional finance measures, how does, for instance, the analytics stack up against other investments being considered by the business?
Yeah, so I think the portfolio approach is very valid. First, finance folks understand portfolios, investment portfolios, so you're already speaking the language. And then what you can do is you have in your portfolio the various arguments that you're trying to make to prove your case, right? So you have an ROI calculation of some sort, and then you'll have some other arguments using some qualitative data or some stories or experiences or outputs that have emerged from your project that can't be captured by the ROI piece, but it's captured elsewhere in the portfolio of measurements. So almost like an index, though that might be overdoing it, because then you're necessarily having to quantify everything, all the factors in the index. So I wouldn't go that far, but certainly a portfolio of different measures.
Great.
So one of the other things that ROI misses completely is intangible value. right? So this is a chart that shows the proportion of S&P 500 companies' market value that is intangible. So just the difference between the market value and the book value. And we've been seeing this growth in the intangible share, and it's quite high. It's 90% measured 5 years ago. And if you actually look at the top 10 most valuable companies in terms of market value, Apple and others, a lot of the value is literally in their brand and reputation and other things. So one other thing that I mentioned before that finance does arithmetic for the most part, but also if you think about this picture, finance is not able to attribute using their tools of accounting 90% of the value of the firm. Then why are we kowtowing to them to get our ROI numbers in shape, right? If they can't assign uh, accounting value beyond just this lump of intangible value, some of it is definable, intellectual property, goodwill when you have a transaction, but a lot of it is not. And in my world, I think a lot about talent and from the world of human resources. In my opinion, a lot of this intangible value is locked up in people related things. It's poor leadership, poor management, poor processes. And I think you can make a similar argument for poor technology that's not able uh, to reveal what this value is, be able to put a label to it, and then take credit for it. So I mean, there's so many things that go into intangible value: improved decision making, data literacy, better competitive advantage, better employee satisfaction and engagement, innovation. There's a lot of things in the intangible bucket. And the role of people analytics, for example, is to identify what are the people drivers of this intangible value, begin to characterize it, and then determine what causes what, or at least what leads to what, and then choose the right investments to at least maintain the intangible value, but ideally even improve it further. Any questions or comments on intangible value?
I have a question on intangible value. I'd like to kind of go back here and address this question that came in. It's a really good one that's hitting on a sort of decentralized or hybrid model, perhaps shifting to a federated analytics model. So what do you do in decision making regarding analytics is spread among executives because the DNA function is spread through the organization, right? So for example, you might have the business unit analytics that reports up through the business unit executive or CAO that is independent of the CTO function who owns enterprise. You might have AI and ML and application development that is independent of the CIO function that reports up through the CFO who makes decisions regarding infrastructure that supports everything. So you have this very complex reporting structure and ownership over the analytics work and the value that's being attributed to it. How do you handle that situation?
It's very tricky, Jason, because you have a whole mixture of decision rights. Who's actually going to make the decision? Who else needs to be consulted and informed? All of that stuff in that decision. Whose numbers are more important? Is business unit A may have a greater need versus business unit B? How is all of that dealt with? It's not a dissimilar situation in HR where you have the CHRO in corporate, but the heads of HR for the different business units or geographies report up into the BU and geography. And so um, the question is, what kind of public goods is the center providing that you can't exclude anyone from in the different businesses, um, but you can't also prevent people from free riding, if you will, not being their share. So the way I have often dealt with this is you've got to try and understand the needs and motivations of the different stakeholders at the center and in the periphery. And you have to figure out what is the what's in it for me for each party and try and make the case or the sale or persuasion around the particular enterprise product you're trying to put in place in terms of how it's going to benefit each each party. And that can take some time, and it may not benefit everyone, in which case it does become a bit of a public good.
Mm, yeah. I'm curious here on your reaction to this comment, which I think is pretty compelling. So my first impression is that the biggest concern with intangible value is when it's concentrated in promises or one or a few public figures and how they relate to a company. And the Matthew here, he says, I know that's not. I know that's not the main purpose of the dialogue here, but something I'll probably keep in mind throughout. To me, this is probably not a good outcome. So the question will be how to accumulate more value, even intangible, while avoiding these outcomes. What's your reaction to that thought?
Yeah, we've seen what happened to Tesla, right? Market value really plummeted. Um, so it's it's hard to measure, hard to pin down, hard to control in some ways, and it's a remainder versus market value. So the market value plummets, so does intangible value as a result. But yeah, I think it's good to keep in mind. So another approach uh, to to move away from ROI is to talk about outcomes. And I've used this schematic in the area of human resources and people analytics. So obviously everything begins with strategy, and you have to be able to convey how your project or your product is going to fit into that and help deliver the strategy and how it impacts various outcomes for the company, mostly financial, customer, and in some cases operational. So what's that benefit? Some of this is measurable and quantifiable, some of it not so much. So in the domain of HR, it's employees that execute, that make the connection between the strategy and the outcomes. And so the role of people analytics becomes understanding what employees bring to the table in terms of their human capital, what they're feeling and thinking, because that drives what they do, how they behave, whether they stay or leave, and that obviously then impacts outcomes. So if you reframe this into you replace employees with technology, technology also enables the enterprise and connects the strategy, enables it, and you get these better outcomes through better technology, through the better application of AI. So I think it's a good mechanism, a good idea to talk about the outcomes. And you can do this in many ways. You can trace the accounting value backwards from the outcome to things that technology influences, that people influence. Um, but if you start with this sort of high level chart and use this even in your conversations with finance to help them understand the relationship between technical problems and relational problems and everything that goes on in between in the people side, and even in the technology side, I think you can begin to get people to understand that it's not just ROI that makes the world go around. So the other thing that I think we have to also do is use more qualitative data. So we tend to over rotate on quantitative, and because we have it's more easily available, more easily measurable. But now I think with the advent of large language models, a lot of the qualitative data that's buried in text and voice and video, but mostly text. This whole domain of knowledge management that becomes a resource. And whether you're trying to craft a better story or trying to create a more persuasive argument, you can tap into qualitative data. Because here, for example, you can talk to people about the impact that the technology has had on them, on their teams. They may not be able to quantify it in an ROI, but they can explain how they're able to work much better, they're faster, more efficient, happier even. And so you can begin to use qualitative data to enhance your stories. And then, at the end of the day, whether it's analytics, AI, or any form of technology, it's all about the adoption. And a dashboard may be elegant, a model may be sound, but unless the organization is ready to absorb it, then value stalls, right? So unless you have adoption, it's unlikely you're going to have any kind of value to show for all of your efforts. So you really got to think hard about adoption. Otherwise, your all your investment, all your hard work is like pushing on a string, right? But why is adoption hard? It's hard in AI because ultimately it's not organizations that adopt AI, it's individuals. And as we said at the beginning, individuals in organizations, by and large, because they've all the news they read, um, and now CEOs are boasting about how they can do with much smaller workforces. There's anxiety and fear, and so that's not the best place to start from in terms of learning more about AI or using it more, especially if they don't understand how it works. So, I've been building products, analytical products, AI products, and over the years, I've realized that we overlook a very simple thing when we think about adoption. And about 10 years ago, I wrote these three laws of workforce analytics. The second one, I think it relates to the second law of thermodynamics in some way, but the consumption of analytics requires effort. And it's a simple statement, of course, but we don't really think hard enough about it, right? So we build a dashboard or we deliver the technology, the system, whatever. We kind of assume, yeah, it makes sense. Now people have dashboards, they have numbers, and they can make data-driven decisions. But it takes effort, especially in HR, where people don't have comfort with using data. And so they have to take an extra step of understanding what the data mean, trying to understand how the dashboard works, what to look for, how to connect the dots. Maybe even have a prior number in their head that they now compare against what the dashboard is telling them. And so we just have to be sensitive to the fact that uh, consuming analytics, consuming technology requires effort, and we can design for that. Let me pause here too, Jason, if there's any question or comment.
Yeah, where would you suggest people start in designing for ease of consumption?
So I think if I look at people analytics, uh, we have to be mindful of the audience, which is often HR business partners. And by and large, until recently, people didn't join HR to look at spreadsheets or run calculations, right? So you have to be mindful of that. You have to be sensitive to it. And so you have to make sure that you're not confusing people. So I've seen, you turn on the dashboard and there are a gazillion things there. No one knows what to do. Where do you even start? So designing in a way that leads you down certain paths. Or even now, with Gen AI and agentic AI, you don't even have to navigate the dashboard. You can just ask because all the data underlying it is structured and labeled and ordered. You can ask for exactly what you're looking for instead of having to go to different tabs, uh, pull something from one tab, connect it to something else, and build your story. You can just ask the agent, a chatbot, what you're looking for. Maybe you make some predictions as well.
I have a couple more questions here.
Yeah.
So going back to the intangible value discussion, where have, and I know that this is contextual to the business environment, et cetera, but where have you experienced the most traction in terms of what you've focused on in the intangible value compartment of your ROI that you bring to the business?
Yeah. So, I was at a company where my role was sort of modernizing HR through people analytics. And we were trying to, in some sense, democratize the ability to make data-driven decisions. So take it away from just the leadership and give it, uh, put the data and insights into the hands of decision makers at all levels of the organization. So you don't have to, you could shorten the distance between the data and insight. Why wait for a committee to make the decision when you could make it, at the scene of the crime, in the business unit, in the department, in that particular situation? And so I was trying to make a case to buy this third-party platform, talent analytics platform. And it was hard for leaders in HR to say no because it was data-driven decision making. That's what they were also trying to accomplish. Um, but they weren't willing to invest because the HR budgets are small. So what I did was I began showing the demo to the general managers of the presidents of the business units. And for them, it was the first time that they had ever had a glimpse of data about their people at this level of detail and this level of richness. And their eyes lit up because now they had access to all of this insight about individuals, teams, and their entire organization in terms of learning, development, rewards, what have you. They could make smarter, faster, better decisions. So um, just seeing that and how easy it was, right? Because the way these platforms are designed, there are all sorts of dashboards and things built up. You just connect the data. There's some work to be done there to make sure the data are flowing to the right channels. But then it lights up like a Christmas tree. And even the CHRO, when I first showed it to them, they didn't get any sleep that night because they just had so much to explore. So I think it's knowledge is power, right? So until now, the BU presidents had to rely on their heads of HR for things, and um, I think they realized that they now had the ability to truly see what was going on, and they appreciated that.
Great.
But
It's great.
different situations require for different approaches, but that there's so much in that intangible value. You have to find what will resonate, what will excite, animate, motivate your decision makers.
Great.
And speaking of leadership, it's when you're trying to change a culture, trying to get more people to adopt something enterprise level. Leadership plays a huge role because they obviously influence the culture, but the leadership modeling of the right behaviors is the most powerful thing you can do. So, in terms of AI adoption, if leaders demonstrate that they're also trying to figure out, these chatbots and they're struggling with writing the right kind of prompt, they're going back and reworking things. People have to see that, and then well, if the CEO is investing time in this and is able to do it, and also he's so smart, he or she is so smart, but they're also having difficulty, then it opens up um, the whole thing for everybody else. So getting the leaders to model the right behavior in terms of adoption and decision making is really really important. And these are a list of things that sort of characterize a data driven organization, but you could probably come up with a similar list of, what are what are the attributes of an enterprise analytics ready organization, and um, begin your persuasion journey from there. So I think this might actually be my last slide, but one of the other devices that I've used in trying to persuade, communicate, and set myself up for receiving investment is to be able to tell the full story of what you're up to. And a lot of this should resonate deeply with your audience, right? So your aspiration should resonate with them. They should also be animated by it. You should have a very clear strategy that's tied to the business strategy, maybe the workforce strategy, technology strategy, and then a real understanding of the environment from your environmental scan. What are the considerations you have to take into account? Maybe it's the degree of data literacy in the organization, perhaps. And then ideally over at least 3 years, sort of lay out what you're going to do, and more important, and the dependencies, but more importantly, what investment you're going to require. And you begin to make the case slowly, right? So you don't want to land up in year three and make the case for a huge investment. You've already laid the groundwork and argued and hopefully persuaded the decision makers about why you need an investment in year one, for something that's going to then bear fruit for another investment or work in year two that couldn't happen without the first investment. So just this sets expectations. I know roadmaps are, everyone does roadmaps, but you have to think of the roadmap now in terms of addressing the relational problem, right? So you'll see here that the top thing is change and adoption, right? And then you have capability as well in there. So you've really got to start leveling your roadmap and your stories, taking into account uh, the fact that we're dealing with relational uh, problems, and that not everyone is going to be ready or comfortable with those kinds of discussions. So the more you can lay it out in a digestible form, the more success you'll have. So I think the next, we have a bunch of winning strategies. I think we've spoken about many of these already. I'd love to hear if anyone has some other ideas based on what we've discussed so far. So, ROI, what world are you living in? The whole world has changed. We're not even using GDP. Why should we use ROI? Get with the program finance. Recognize the adaptive relational challenge, reframe, look at non-financials, create these compelling narratives and stories about outcomes, uh, bring in more qualitative data, pay attention to the consumption of technology, and then really paint a compelling vision of the future. One so compelling that people want to go there. They want you to do the hard work to get us there, and therefore they'll open up the wallet and give you some investment. I think we can do questions, and I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, lots of just great questions and comments have come through the discussion. So thanks everybody. Here's a question. I want to recommend my organization go through a business capability mapping process, leveraging the APQC best practices as a starting point. Uh, uh, I am kind of out on a limb here. Does this work well as a starting point for ROI? That's the crux of that question.
So I think starting with any degree of structure or some known framework helps to get your decision maker at least in the right frame of mind, right? So if the APQC framework that you mentioned is something that's maybe part of the culture, that's the first step. So it's no big surprise in terms of a reframe, right? It's the same language. So I think it helps. These when you go through these frameworks, it helps you to almost do some navel gazing, right? You've got to think about what you do, how you do it, and that's very important because you will come up with some issues or challenges, relational perhaps, certainly technical, that you have to think about in the solution and in the ask. So I would suggest, yeah, it's if you have something that resonates with the organization, use it. And if you don't have something that resonates, but still starts with some structure, some way to get the conversation going that engages the decision makers, then I'm all for it.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. So as you know, strategy is executed by employees. So what role should frontline feedback play in ROI measurement?
So these are the stories from the front, literally from the front, that paint a picture of what's actually happening,
Mm,
right? Because a lot of the financial reporting or other kinds, it's sort of removed from where the rubber meets the road.
mhm.
So hearing narratives, videos of people in the front lines, what they're dealing with, that folks in the office, the back office, the C-suite have no idea of. It's out of their experience, um, doesn't factor into, how they measure and run the organization. Those are golden. Stories move people much more than numbers do. And so if you can get the right people to tell those stories in the right way, um, make movies.
For lack of a better term here, how have you operationalized that process? Because I mean, yeah, how do you coach your team, or what sort of processes have you put in place to have a kind of a sustained flow of those stories, and codifying them and putting structure around them and delivering them to the business?
Yeah, I will say it's gotten much easier with technology and make
Yeah.
just so much easier to make a video or capture something. And it's because everyone's making these TikTok videos, so people are more natural. They don't have to think too much. So when I was starting people analytics teams from scratch, whether at Apple or McKesson, Fortune 10 companies, with no history of people analytics before, but a strong desire, we often had to explain who we were, what we were doing. And so I used to encourage my team to capture moments of history as the tide began to turn, as we uh, came up with stuff. The look on people's faces when they saw the first dashboard that truly resonated with them. Taking the trouble to capture quotes. Oh, I used the dashboard; it's amazing, and I was able to do this. Capture all of that. Um, Interview people so you can use it later on because if you can begin using quotes and put little clips in your PowerPoints, it just enriches. But it takes some mind, some thought. Um, but like I said, it's so much more easy these days, and I think many organizations, internal communications departments, are hungry for this because it enriches the conversation and dialogue within the company. So if you need help, I think go to your internal comms folks. They should be able to help you with the infrastructure.
Hmm. Okay. All right. Um, how this kind of hits into the political realm a bit here. How can analytics leaders protect their teams from being judged by the wrong metrics?
Very, very important. And analytics leaders, they have to be transformation leaders because they're wreaking some sort of transformation in the organization. They have to be adaptive leaders in the sense that they're helping employees adapt to a new situation, a new platform, a new way of doing things. But they also have to be leaders in the sense that they shield their organization, their teams from a lot of the politics and power plays and other nonsense that happens at their level. So I think you have to help people focus on what you hired them for, what they're good at, and help them grow in those areas, but try and avoid exposing them to some of the politics. And it happens, there's and in my coaching business, for example, it's coaching analytics leaders who often come from a quantitative background,
Mhm.
and the thinking is, boss, here's the regression output, and sort of their job is done, and they expect people to be excited about the regression output, the coefficients. So help them navigate the politics, help them realize that they're, even in their small world, there are power lines that you have to negotiate and navigate to get your point across and have a successful career.
Okay. All right. Great. That's a great ending point for us. Amit, thank you so much. Thanks for your insights here, your experiences. Very valuable discussion. Again, thank you everybody for your comments and questions. We just have a couple of minutes left here. So we will be sharing the recording and slides of this webinar in an upcoming email, and it will also be available on our website. Please take one moment to give feedback on this session. You should see a box come up. It helps us develop timely and relevant content for the community, so please take a moment to provide feedback for this session. Stay tuned on our email and social channels for tools and resources and other content to help you rethink how to capture and communicate analytics and AI value. As mentioned at the top of the session, a good place to start is our ROI Resource Hub, which answers questions like, why doesn't traditional ROI capture the real value of analytics? What's a better way to define and measure analytics value? How do you measure value when analytics is federated? What does it mean to make smarter bets with analytics? A lot of this stuff Amit covered today. The Hub is exclusive roundtable insights, peer insights, as well as key takeaways from real expert exchanges. So give it a minute and check it out. We look forward to seeing you in August for Scott Friesen's framework on communicating analytics value. It's a really nice pairing to this session, so we look forward to seeing you there. Until then, onward and upward, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.